of this, these protests in Anderton and Parkfield or Parkview?
Parkfield is one of the schools, and Anderton Park, I think, is it.
I find it like really, really interesting how the Muslim community protesting outside of these schools has been portrayed. I mean, all of the interviews that I've seen on the BBC, you've got Muslim women wearing the hijab saying, look, we don't have an issue with homosexuality, we're not homophobic, but we want to be able to teach our own children about sexuality and relationships.
Yeah.
This is a job for the parents.
Yeah.
And they're being represented in the House of Lords. Jess Phillips, an MP for Birmingham, Andy Street, Mayor for West Mids, the national media, and the Guardian, Independent, the op-eds, all these middle-class white commentators as a bunch of raving homophobes. I'm not going to deny that there were some raving homophobes waving placards. Yeah. Can't deny that.
Yeah.
But to say that's what they all are, binary description of them as raging homophobes, and on the other hand, the LGBT community fighting for equality, is completely absurd. But I think that what I thought was really interesting was that I bet if it was white Jewish middle-class women, white middle-class women that were protesting, they would not be treated that way. People will be interested in hearing what they're saying, the nuance, the subtlety. But because they are brown, hijabi, Pakistani women in probably the poorest, if not one of the poorest areas in Birmingham, there's no connection between Middle England, middle class society that forms these opinions, that reports these opinions in the national media, in the press, at the political level, in the legislature, whatever. There's no connection between them and these women on the ground in Alham Rock in Washington Heath. They can not understand and empathise with their opinions. And I think that, you know, if the race of the people that were protesting was different, and I accept that if the protests were done in a slightly more sophisticated way, people will be a lot more interested in engaging with what they've got to say.
Is that not playing the victim card in the sense of saying that actually these mothers are, and I think the protesters, large majority of them are women. I mean, considering the fact that they have come out, they've used what is a process to counter. How nuanced are you expecting it to be? Because it seems to me that these mothers are getting out there and they are talking and they are sharing.
But what about how they're represented?
But the representation that these mothers have, I think one of the ladies is the sister of the infamous Shakil Afzal, one of the main protesters. She's come out, she's talking, she's a very articulate lady. Are her views being represented?
Have you seen her on TV? Have you seen her?
Yeah, I've seen her a couple of times. Yeah.
So you think they're being reported accurately, fairly?
I mean, the way that the whole thing is being captured, I think, is yes. I do think it's not entirely accurate in representing the different nuances within the community, and it's very easy. I think it is very easy to call it homophobic. But having said that, can you give it space if there is homophobia within the narrative that the counter-protest is actually happening?
Well, a good example of what you said about Shakil Afzal, right? So it's reported again and again in every kind of press or tweet or comment that he's got no children at school, which is true. He doesn't have any children at school.
He's got nephews at the school, nieces.
Yeah, but he doesn't have. But it's reported as he has no children at school. Now, obviously, LGBT protesters come along and say, well, these protests are homophobic, and they counter-protest. They don't have children at school.
Yeah.
That's not reported.
Yeah.
So the emphasis is, well, this guy is leading a ragtag bunch of protesters.
No, but the LGBT are representing LGBT. What he's representing is the parents. What he's not representing is the Muslim community. And that's the reason why they're going after him, saying, how can you be a representative of parents?
But what do you mean they're representing LGBT? What does that
So
mean?
in terms of LGBT, the community itself, understanding that can we, within the curriculum itself, have a curriculum that is supportive of the LGBT community, but one that doesn't necessarily kind of sideline them, one that doesn't ignore them completely within the curriculum space, within literature, within the different spaces that curriculum is taught, so that LGBT communities are recognized as a community as opposed to somebody that you encounter later on in life.
Yeah, but
I think that's what it is. The LGBT community is saying we want to have a space within the school. Now the question is at what age? Of course, that's something to debate.
What do you think about that?
I would say that LGBT community, as with any community, any protected community, needs to be reflected within the curriculum. How that reflection occurs is something that we can actually explore. I think this issue here is, and look, the How much nuances are you expecting for the media to pick up on these parents when all they're doing is holding placards saying,
But they're not the
my
one. I
children.
mean, they're sharing their views. If they're interviewed, they're sharing their views.
Yeah.
Their views are actually not.
But where are the leaders? Where are actually leaders of the community that can articulate with some nuances that do have access to the media?
But the leaders of the community, now we're talking about elected politicians,
or even
whatever,
unelected
don't want to be
politicians.
anywhere near this because they
Yeah.
know that they're going to get a lot of flack from the LGBT community. They'll be criticised by people in their own party for being homophobic, even though it's not necessarily homophobic. A lot of the parents that have been interviewed, the views that they've articulated are along the lines that as parents we have the primary right, if not the complete right, to teach our children issues of sex and relationships. And that's an uncontroversial opinion. Until the law changed, that was the standard position for primary schools at least, right? The funny thing is, I have no idea what on earth the state is doing and what schools are doing teaching children about relationships in primary school. I would have thought if they were doing a great job of teaching kids, especially in deprived areas, let's be honest, where the poorest schools are, the crappiest schools are, if they were teaching them, doing a brilliant job of teaching them reading and writing and maths, and they had a lot of spare time on their hands, knock yourself out, teach them whatever you like. But that's not the case.
Yeah.
We know the performance when it comes to primary and secondary school children in Birmingham inner city schools is really poor.
Yeah.
So
why
why
are the
is
parents
this?
protesting about that?
Well,
That's the question, isn't it?
yeah.
So
well,
up until now, the parents haven't protested about any of the failings of the school, or even in terms of representation of the Muslim community within the curriculum. What's going on there?
But that's a good point. But that's the nature of the Muslim community, isn't it? We all know the Muslim that has a girlfriend, has sex before marriage,
That's right.
or drinks.
Yeah.
We'd never question that he's a Muslim.
Yeah.
We'd all accept that he's a Muslim.
Yeah.
Obviously, he's just not a very good one, or he's sinful in that respect. But when you bring homosexuality in the equation, oh my God, he can't be Muslim, he's gay.
Yeah.
Well, no, it does not follow at all.
Yeah.
Being heterosexual is not a prerequisite to being a Muslim. So I suppose, in looking at it from that context, the Muslim community is very quick to get riled up about anything to do with homosexuality.
So is that not self-homophobic then?
But
Because there is a phobia. So, for example, if these schools were teaching, and they have been teaching, relationship and sex education for a long time, and parents had the clause to take their children out. Should they want to withdraw, then they can do that. Vast majority of parents don't do that.
so do they even know?
Right.
Are these parents engaged?
But again, are you not guilty of doing the exact same thing that these parents don't know? They don't have that knowledge. Maybe they do have the knowledge and they accept it and say that actually my children should know. Like where does it come from that they don't know?
Yeah, true.
Maybe they do know, but something has happened for them to think actually we need to actively, aggressively in some places protest against our children being taught about homosexuality, which. If you look at all the protests and you gather the placards, there's very little being said about teaching our children about relationship and sex earlier on. It's almost entirely. I haven't seen any placard.
I agree with you on the placards point.
Yeah.
The placard point, is completely valid.
Or even outside the placard point, people who are actually being interviewed, they are contesting the simple point that we don't want our children to learn about. Non-heterosexual relationships.
No, I don't think so. I don't know what interviews obviously you've listened to, but the ones I've listened to on BBC News, for example, and I recall a couple of interviews of women and an interview of a man. They were very clear. They said, look, we've got no issues about homosexuality. Of course, gay people exist. We're not stupid. We don't think that if you pretend they don't exist, somehow your children will grow up not looking at those issues or whatever. Our issue is that we want to teach our children about sex relationships. The interesting point you raised, which I don't know what the answer is to it, is that if this was some sort of principled position about sex and relationships, why have they never protested about heterosexual relationships being taught? I totally agree. That's been a standard kind of on the menu of education in secondary schools for a long time. I'm not sure in primary schools the sex education, relationship education.
It's been brought in terms of sex education. It's termed relationship education within the primary.
But my understanding was the law's only just passed and is coming into effect in 2020 about relationship education in primary school.
Yeah.
So before this, so let's just say 2 years ago, was relationship education being taught in schools?
Not as in from my own understanding of it and what I know, having worked in primary schools, it wasn't expected to be taught. So a lot of primary schools didn't actually teach it.
So then it's right, isn't it? I mean, they're not necessarily. There may be some of people specifically protesting the homosexuality point, but there equally may be people protesting against the concept of it completely.
I accept that may be the case. I mean, in terms of observably, the vast majority of those are saying that they do not want their children to learn about the different types of relationships early on. Okay, so let's kind of change the parameters a little bit. Would this be the same case from your point of view? Do you think that these same parents would have an issue in secondary school education?
Oh yeah, of course.
Okay, so then it's not an age issue, then, is it?
No, not for the parents, but for me, my issue is, I frankly think it's absurd if any parent was to say that I don't want my children to learn about homosexuality. First of all, learning about homosexuality ain't going to make it gay.
Yeah.
Any more than learning about heterosexuality.
Do you think the parents think that? Or do you think the parents think that this is a... Because I've heard... I mean, I've spoken to some of these parents off the record, and their point of view is, if them teaching... I asked them straight, sort of, what would happen if your child was to learn about homosexual relationships? A woman and a woman, a man and a man. What actually would happen? And they said, well, this opens the door for our children to think it's a possibility. Now, therein then lays a gross, misinformation that to learn about homosexuality suddenly makes you homosexual.
Yeah, but that's obviously ridiculous. But on top of that, it's ridiculous that they will pick it up from school. I mean, homosexual relationships are portrayed in the mass media. They're on television, they're in films, okay? And, I'll give you the example of drugs. We can try our level best that our children never learn about drugs, but they will learn about drugs.
That's right.
From their friends, from the internet.
They'll
watch videos on YouTube, exactly, YouTube, Grand Theft Auto. So it's completely preposterous that they live in a pure clinical environment and only the schools are exposing them to homosexuality. That's completely preposterous, so that's absurd. And I don't know if parents really think about it, they really believe that. I mean, superficially they might, but I don't know if they really think about it, they believe that.
So look, here's a question.
My personal issue is, schools have got no business at primary level teaching about relationships, full stop, period.
Okay.
So are we expecting primary school children to have relationships? What relevance is that to them?
Okay, so you're saying actively it should not be taught. What about passively?
But passively,
Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah, but
that's passively the existence of. So I'm asking you the question: if you had a Romeo and Juliet, or you had a Romeo and Antonio, right, and that literature is being taught, so it's a more passive way. Do you think that's acceptable?
But is that? But I mean, I'm not. Excuse my ignorance, but is Romeo and Juliet taught at primary school?
I don't know. I mean, I'm just using that as an example. But if there was an equivalent.
But my issue is primary school. I mean, secondary school. I think my personal view is, sex and relationship education should be mandatory. There should be no opt-outs at secondary school.
That's right.
At the moment, there is opt-out for sex education, especially at year 10, year 11. Children that are going into adulthood and becoming young adults need to be.
And what should it prepare them for?
To have physical relationships.
Okay.
They need to be equipped to understand sex. They need to be equipped to understand STIs, condoms, and so on and so forth. Right? They need that education. Now, my personal opinion, in principle, is that parents should be doing that. But I accept parents don't do that. I accept there's a failure.
Yeah.
That's why the state originally stepped in.
Yeah.
And I accept that for whatever reason, parents, because it's awkward or whatever, they're not equipped to do it, don't want to do it, can't do it, I'm not doing it. The state should do it. It's bizarre that sex education at that level, at 10 and 11, years 10 and 11, it's necessary, but you can still opt out.
Yeah.
And the government won't do anything about it. I pull my children out, I won't teach them anything. It's fine. They will never learn about sex from me or the school. That's completely preposterous. That's completely stupid. That's where the emphasis should be. Okay, if you want to opt out, we need to be satisfied as a school or whatever that the children are going to be learning about sex.
Yeah.
So you're doing your job if you don't want us to do it. Instead, the focus is on relationship and sex education at primary school, which is where it's completely irrelevant.
No, but I think those are two different things. So from a sex education point of view, you're preparing that particular child in their own sexual endeavors. That's what it essentially is about. So you're teaching them about, how to protect yourself from any diseases and what have you. So that's directly related to them. And should a parent choose to opt out, I'm hoping, and I'm going to, hope this is the case, that parents who choose to opt out will essentially then use their own methods to teach their children about sex education.
But applying this to the Muslim community, right?
So,
do you think Muslim parents do that?
No. I mean, no.
It's a given, right? We all know that.
I would say, however, from my own experience of parents who did opt out, is that, my advice to them was make sure that you do sit down with your children and you do this. And I had no reason to believe that those parents who do opt out will do so.
Okay,
right?
I think there's an interesting point here. So the parents where I say absolutely don't do it, and we know that they don't do it.
Yeah.
I'm talking about parents of my parents' generation.
Yeah.
The people that came here from abroad.
Yeah.
Oh God, sex taboo.
Yeah.
When you get married, you sort of figure it out.
Yeah.
But obviously, people that are born in Britain that grew up with sex, that had relationships, we understand that given the crazy kind of upbringing we had about this with sex as a taboo, it's really damaging and unhealthy.
Yeah.
So obviously I would teach my own child about sex, and I think it's very, very important that I do. Probably you will. A lot of British-born Muslims will I think do that. So I draw a distinction between the practices of the past and the practices of the future, and the current British-born generation.
Yeah.
But still, even in that group, even in the British-born Muslim group, there will be a lot of Muslims that are practicing Muslims, right, with the beards and the thobes, right, that will say, oh, we're not going to talk to our children about sex because that will encourage them to have sex.
Yeah, but I think this is where this is where I take issue with it, because having spoken to some of these parents and even individuals in the community, I was with a friend of mine yesterday, and he knows what my views on this are, and he said, well, don't you think that this is a plot to his words? Don't you think that this is a plot to destabilize the Muslim community? I said, what do you mean? I said, the LGBT lobby, has done very, very well to make its community recognized and a protected community. And now what they're doing is, his words, the abused have become the abusers of Muslims. These are his point of view. So for him now, sex education and this relationship education in primary is a tool to destabilize the Muslim community. It's not actually about whether children should or shouldn't learn. It's become now about this big conspiracy theory to kind of, make Muslims more secular, etc., all of this kind of thing, as opposed to, and this is where I think sex education, religious education should be mandatory. And
Religious education?
Even religious education should be mandatory. But for everybody. They should learn about all different faiths. So where I take...
Well, it follows, if you're going to learn about homosexuality and you're going to learn about sex, the other communities, for example, the Muslim, the Jewish, the Hindu, or whatever, will say, well, hang on a second, we should equally have our perspective, our views, our beliefs taught as well.
I mean, you get different types of curriculums within RE. RE has a...
Well, RE is not mandatory though, is it?
No, it's not mandatory, but in terms of you can opt out of it should the school put it on the curriculum in that sense. I think there's certain years where they do teach it.
But I wonder if they teach RE at primary school.
No, they do, yeah, of course they do. But you can opt out. You can withdraw from collective worship and from RE. My point
is that still the case?
I believe so, yeah.
So you can opt out of RE,
Yeah.
but not opt out of the state's view of what a relationship is.
Yeah.
I mean, that's completely ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, but the issue here isn't about... I mean, there's two things. So one is whether you should or shouldn't be able to opt out. That's one thing. Look, should your child be able to opt out from English and maths and all that? And that's what I think, no. In terms of sex education, in terms of relationship education, in terms of RE, we should not be able to opt out from it. Having said that, we need to be playing a part as a Muslim community and informing what we think are valuable elements within the curriculum that need to be taught. So when we're teaching about sex, I think it's important to understand that when we're teaching about sex, we teach it within a context of when you're having a relationship with your partner. You don't even need to say marriage, say partner, because what you're doing is you're encouraging to have sex within a marital or even a relationship context, which is a lot more healthier than to suggest that actually, sex is with anyone and everybody that you see on a Friday night kind of thing. So we need to be able to say, okay, what our views are, and I think that's where one of the...
You mean through the school, or you mean at home?
Through the school, absolutely. As a parenting body, and therein, I think it's not just a Muslim issue anymore. You've got parents from all backgrounds, including parents who are from a humanist background, atheist background, whatever, who do believe that we need to be able to teach such subjects within a context that's conducive to a healthy
Yeah, but you talk about all
sense
parents. I mean, you know the SRE law. The DFE put out the consultation for the law, and the majority of parents
Yeah.
said they opposed it. The majority of parents opposed it. So the government overruled that, and it's white paper.
Did the majority of the parents understand it though?
Well, I'm not being funny, but if you're going to go to the effort of consulting with the government on a white paper proposed law, I'm pretty sure you know what you're talking about. I mean, who did you do that? I didn't do that.
No, I
mean,
didn't. But how many parents were involved?
I don't know. But the point is, the parents that looked at that and gave their views to the government. And remember, your views only count if you give them.
Yeah.
Were opposed to it. The majority. Now, interestingly, the government completely put that to one side, ignored the parents, which are the people that have the biggest stake in this legislation and this change of government policy, and instead basically adopted the position of Stonewall.
Okay.
Stonewall did a survey of gay people that said their sex education was unsatisfactory.
Okay, so I think even heterosexual education in the sex education for heterosexual element of it is also unsatisfactory.
Yeah, no, but the point is that the survey focused on people that said their sex education was unsatisfactory because they were gay and there was no gay specific sex education. Now, obviously, that from an equality point of view, that's a fair point, and that needs to be addressed, because between heterosexual and homosexual children, when they are getting sex education,
Yeah.
they should get equal access to that sex education.
Yeah.
The problem, of course, in at an education level is you can't say, right, who's gay, who's straight. Well, the gay boys and girls, let's go and give you some gay sex education. You can't do that because, of course, there may be a number of different reasons why children are not sure, they don't want to come out, whatever. Of course, it's not appropriate to do it that way. So you have to give a generic sex education that covers homosexual and heterosexual children, which is, I think, the point that Stonewall was originally making with this.
But that's still secondary school.
Well,
That's not primary school.
I wouldn't say off the top of my head whether it was one or the other, but
No, you wouldn't have sex education being taught in primary school.
well, the law now is that it can be taught at the discretion of the school.
Okay.
So the emphasis of their report to the government, to the DFE, was that sex education provision is not equal, which is true, and you can't argue against that because that's a fair point. The government just adopted that data. They didn't, do additional research. They didn't do additional consultation. They didn't verify. I'm not saying for a moment that it's not true. It sounds true to me. So it makes sense. But the response to that was then to introduce the SRE legislation to deal with sex and relationships. Now, I've got a number of problems with this. The first is that you can't just ignore the views of parents as a group. That's completely wrong. And secondly, never before, from my knowledge, has a lobby group, a specific lobby group that has a specific remit, decided what the content of the curriculum would be, which is bizarre. There is no real consultation with the community. Forget the Muslim community. I mean, any community really. If the parents have been ignored and you literally just adopted the position, a lot of people have said that the DFE has been captured by Stonewall, and I think that's probably an accurate description. On top of that, the only
is that necessarily a bad thing, though? I mean, in terms of, first and foremost, in order to really understand this and unpack it, Stonewall exists for a particular purpose.
Yes.
And that purpose is...
It's not education, though.
Yeah, but what is it?
Well, the purpose of the original purpose of the existence of Stonewall was to fight for the civil rights of gay people.
That's right. And Stonewall has had a material that it has produced to support teachers in teaching about this, and they've had that for
they've
some
identified
time.
A problem as regards the gay community, which is a completely legit problem to identify and to address.
Yeah.
The question is, should it be addressed in the way that it's being addressed, and also should the solution that's being proposed exclude consultation from all of the people?
Right.
That's my point. The interesting thing about this consultation, so-called consultation, is the government then relied upon a survey of young people, secondary school students, and said, they want more sex education, so they support it. Well, of course, you go to 15, 14-year-olds and say, you want more sex education. What do you think they're going to say? They're not going to say no. Yeah. But interestingly, the government, the state, doesn't want to listen to parents, but will go over their head to the children and ask them. Now, what I find really interesting and hypocritical is when young people say they want the vote, governments are interested in following what they say about that.
Yeah.
You're too stupid to have the vote. You're too thick to have the vote. You don't have agency to have the vote. You're too immature to have the vote. You don't understand the complexities of the vote, even though the vote is a pretty simple concept, which party to vote for. If young people say, for example, they want the legalization of drugs, which young people generally do support, they don't listen to that. So when it suits them, and when it suits their own interests and their own power and the dynamics of power and the dynamics of the electoral, maths, they're not interested in young people.
But is that not because, in terms of what they are asking children, in terms of these young children, whether they were 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds, is that what they were consulting them on what was within the remit of them as students within the school. But in terms of, and I think that this is not an argument about, not a discussion about whether children, 16-year-olds should be able to vote, but that goes outside of their immediate remit of existence. If they vote for a particular party, that influences the direction of the entire country, whereas them wanting education, more sex education, essentially influences them within their school capacity. So it's not necessarily a like for like.
If the government was to consult on students about whether the quality of education is good enough or not, fair point.
But is that because the lobby for that element is stronger, and therefore they were able to get the view of young people?
Yeah, of course.
Implicitly, is it incorrect to get the view of young people in shaping the education?
No, it's not.
I think it should be one important factor, not the ultimate factor, but it should be an important factor.
Yeah, no, I agree. But first of all, if it was about quality of education, yes, of course, young people will be the best placed, along with parents, to know.
Yeah.
If it was about, I say proper education, which is a proper role of the state, for example, mathematics, science, history, whatever, if they're saying, well, do you want more of this? I understand that, and that it would make sense to ask young people about that, along with parents and educators. But when it comes to moral education, when it comes to teaching children about the concepts of life, what are essential to being a human being, which frankly the state has got no business teaching anybody, and frankly the government doesn't know anything about this and can't hold a particular view on it any more than any other institution, which is what the government is. I don't think that young people should have any kind of input in it at whatsoever, because it's a duty, the prime duty of parents, to teach children what it is a human being, what is a relationship, what is the society around them, how do we interpret it, and what do we believe in it.
Yeah.
Parents, of course, are entitled first to give their view, even if they're wrong. Now, I say this as a Muslim Asian man. If a BNP parent was teaching their children Asian people are not equal to white people, of course that's wrong, that's reprehensible, but they can do that, and that is the right, I believe, of parents, even if they're wrong. The right of parents to teach their children their values, even if the values are wrong.
So if there is, this is coming out from a different angle now. So if within school there is a term that the teacher is loco parentis. So when the parent hands over the child to the school, essentially the teacher is in place of the parent. During the time frame of when the child is within the confines of the school, the teacher essentially has the loco parentis role and responsibility. So parents and teachers working together is essentially allows children to have a realization that my home life and my school life are, singing from the same proverbial hymn sheet.
Yeah.
Okay, or nasheed sheet, however you want to look at it. What's happened here is there's been created a competition. In the end of it, the child itself is now, whether they're consciously aware of it or not, but ultimately there is a narrative that is pulling them from home, and there's a narrative that's pulling them from school, government, or what have you. What's going to happen to those young people going forward if they've got this contradiction here? So the two adults in this situation, right, these groups, are not talking to each other.
Yeah.
Right? So how do we resolve this? So you've got, and I think it's important to move away from Anderton School, because I think that's a poor example of a leadership team or a head teacher that I don't think has been very favourable of the community. That's just my experience of what I've observed in the situation itself. But nor have these parents typically been forthcoming in what is an alternative.
Yeah.
So it's very easy to say, actually, we don't think it needs to happen at 4 years old. Okay, so what is the alternative that your consultation is?
About alternatives, one funny thing about the consultation, there's a group of religious organisations, I think Christian, Jews and Muslim, I think there's a sort of a federal group or federation of them. Their consultation about sex education, the government said, well, what's the alternative? What do you propose as an alternative? And they said that you teach them abstinence. So you teach children abstinence. I mean, of course, at primary school, if it's going to be taught, that is what absolutely you should be teaching them. But at secondary school, I mean, that's completely absurd.
Yeah.
We can teach. Frankly, I was taught abstinence. I'm sure everybody was taught abstinence, but it's not of any relevance, to anybody. There's a problem with the Christian right in America. If you teach abstinence, you don't.
You ill prepare.
Well, you don't give them anything for not abstaining.
Yeah.
Right. So the argument is you can't give them something for not abstaining because then they won't abstain.
Yeah.
But of course, it's not the case that they will just follow you like sheep. Children don't follow their parents at some point like sheep.
So here's a question then. Can relationship and sex education be taught in absence of the spiritual and religious persuasions of those children in that school?
Well, this is my point, isn't it? I mean, this is the whole argument, not made just by Muslims, although the Muslims are the ones, the bogeymen that are put out in the press and the media, because they're the easiest to criticize. They are the ones that are easiest to denigrate.
Are they the ones making the most noise?
I don't think so. I mean, there's examples of protests by Jews.
Yeah.
There's strong, and I wouldn't say physical protests, but protests in terms of the literature, the consultation, the publications of Christian groups. And the point of the Christian groups, I thought a really interesting Christian group that I read a paper, they wrote a paper about it online. They said, well, the state is now encroaching on what is a human being. When you teach somebody what is a relationship, or what counts as a relationship, you're really teaching them what essentially is a human being, what is a family.
Yeah.
And we can all have different views about that, and we do. But it's not the government's role to teach children what that is. Now, when you raise a child, for example, and you teach them that the physical world you live in and the physical existence you have right now is not everything.
That's right.
There is, for example, an afterlife. You are a spiritual being. Remember, spiritual being is not scientific. That's a question of belief.
Yeah.
There is no spirit that you can find somewhere in your body. So when you teach a child about the spirit, you teach the child about God, for example. You teach the child about there being a world outside the material world, the physical world.
Yeah.
You raise them with certain values, which I think are personally quite important. Now, what you then know about everything in the world, from working, from property, from relationships, to food, consumption, how you treat people, what are your values about the most mundane to the most significant things, all fit within that prism of the big question as to what is life. And parents, from a very young age, teach their children what is life, not in a direct way, this is life, but in an indirect way, by sharing their values with them, by showing them by example their values.
Yeah.
You can't pick out one bit of it and say in a vacuum, well, we're going to teach you what this is. Not properly. And this is why I think this whole thing is completely absurd. You cannot teach whatever, let's just say the object is to raise children or create children or citizens that are not homophobic. Let's just say that's the object.
Which I think is quite an explicit objective.
But this will never work. This will never produce that result because...
What will not?
This teaching SRE, teaching sex education, teaching gay sex education, whatever you want to teach them at primary school or secondary school, will not produce that object.
Okay.
I'll tell you why. Because children learn primarily who they are from their parents. And parents can completely contradict what the school teaches them at home. And if it's done in this kind of cataclysmic, dialectical, oppositional way, parents will be doing that. They will go out of their way to do that, which obviously affects the child and does not produce the aims that you want to produce, that you're trying to achieve anyway. The better way to do it is to try and teach it in a context that reflects the values of the child, if they're religious or whatever the values are.
But can a school here in the UK, firstly, in terms of should they, and secondly, how is it possible to look at all the different persuasions and realizing that when you're teaching a child about sex education, you're going to have, even if you had 99% children from a Muslim persuasion, even within those you're going to get a whole variable, some will be on the more liberal spectrum, some will be more on the traditional conservative spectrum. So how do you teach them sex education? Because I would want my children to know about sex education. I would want my children to experience what actually sex education is, and then I talk to them and draw out what we agree with, what we don't agree with, because it's important to actually create, for me, I think it's important for my children to understand, actually, this is the viewpoint that my parents believe in, this is the viewpoint that the school is suggesting is a viewpoint, and now let's come to an idea collectively as parents and saying, well, actually, this is the reason what it is, and this is why we, tease it out into this way, or whatever it essentially may be. So I think it's almost impossible to teach children their religious persuasion on
No, you
sex
can't- no,
education.
no, you
However,
can't. Yeah.
what you can do is you can teach children about sex education.
Yeah.
You can teach them. And I think the parallel we have to draw on is religious education. Because religious education, I think, has not been appropriately taught in schools. It's taught, you've got a almost wholly Islamic education, religious education curriculum. You have an almost wholly Christian religious education, and then you have a more generalized religious education. The first two, for me, I think, are in a school setting inappropriate. Children should learn about all faiths and no faiths. Learn about it, explore it. That in itself will not convert you if you understand what are they. In the same way, when it comes to the different types of relationships, teaching children that there are various types of relationships is important for them to understand that actually in the society that we're living in, people who are bisexual, homosexual, whatever it is, the different pronouns that people wish to use respectfully, that this is something that is in the society that we're living in. Teach about them.
Leave the gender and the pronoun thing to
Okay, right.
That's a hot potato.
Yeah,
and
but
it kind of
in
works.
any event, the point is, it is all, in the first instance, what is the principle that allows us to duly give it the consideration, and that is that this exists in our society. Okay?
Of course.
So,
Yeah.
the question now is for parents is, how do we prepare our children, working with the school, to respect this and at the same time maintain our own viewpoint? I think as parents, children should learn this, and then the parents
But at
can.
primary school,
Right now,
we have no view on whether it's at primary school or not.
I think at primary school, actively teaching children about relationships is very problematic. In terms of actively saying there are this type of relationships, because to the
Why
child,
on earth would a child need to know that at 5 years old or 4 years old? I mean, what relevance is it to the child's life?
I mean, it's the suggestion is that if children, from the very beginning of them understanding relationships, also realize that there are alternative relationships out there,
Yeah, but
then there's no room for any almost binary views that
But
come about.
that's completely absurd, though, right? So racism, discrimination has been outlawed in this country. When I say racism, I mean the practice of giving racist speech, hate speech, has been outlawed since the 70s. Okay, and for the best part of 40 or 50 years now, in the media and in the press, perhaps not to the extent that we want, and in the education system, people have learned about different communities, different religious groups. But we still have 18, 19, 20, 21, 25-year-olds that are bigots, that are racists, that are Islamophobes, that are anti-Semitic. So clearly, if that was going to produce a more tolerant young society, young citizenry, then that would be reflected in a reduction in homophobia, anti-Semitism,
Yeah, but
racism.
the
It
education
hasn't-
system in the UK is very much largely Eurocentric. We know that. It's not actually drawing on the different backgrounds of and celebrating the different
but hang on,
achievements
hang on.
of communities
But
in order to actually value
But
that.
it would make more sense, right? Surely, if we're trying to reduce homophobia or hate crime against gay people, for example, argument's sake, isn't it better that we think, right, let's look at where the problems are, right? We've got 50,000 people, or whatever it is, 40,000 people a year that are cautioned for or convicted of hate crimes against gays, or hate speech or whatever. They must have a mandatory education about something or other that helps them.
But they're still
understand.
reactionary.
No, I know, but at least we're dealing with.
So as educationalists, we don't deal with reactionary responses. What we have
I'm
to
not
deal
talking
with.
about education. I'm talking about state, because education is just what the state does.
But you can't ignore the education implementation of this. So what we have to look at is, whilst the state, and in terms of what the state is trying to do, it's looking at in terms of LGBT experience within the NHS sector and within other sectors too, to ensure that they have an appropriate dealing within those spaces. So within the education world, it has to be a proactive approach to how do you prepare children. For me, one of the problems I have is with the No Outsiders program. So the No Outsiders program, apparently, and I haven't seen it all, so I'm going to be very open and say that from what I know about it, and I could be wrong, from what I know about it is it draws on around 32 different books that look at different issues of equality. I think race is in there, LGBT issues are in there too. 5 of those, as far as I know, are dealing with homosexuality overtly, right? Now, again, as far as I know, not a single book overtly talks about Islamophobia. to me that's quite problematic.
In the No Outsiders
program.
So nobody is an outsider.
Yeah.
Except the Muslims, there might be outsiders.
Yeah, I mean, indirectly from a colleague of mine who has seen the material, indirectly you can draw on and further personalize it for the Muslim community. But given the fact that the far right is on a huge rise at this moment in time, surely you'd think that the No Outsiders program would overtly be discussing the normalization of Muslims within the curriculum. To me, that's the one of the issues that are problematic to me. The other issue is the No Outsiders program, which is essentially being hailed as this vehicle through which you teach what the government wants you to teach. And bearing in mind, it's not a mandatory program. The No Outsiders program is a program that schools are adopting because it does a few things. A, it covers some of the equality requirements, but B, also covers some of the British values and related to the prevent issue and that what have you. So the schools are required to teach British values because why? The idea is that it will proactively deal with any children who will be on the trajectory of extremism. To me, again, that narrative is a very problematic narrative because it implies that these children that we're talking about, Muslim children, are beginning with a starting point where they are homophobic. And if we don't,
the starting point is that without intervention, they'll be radicalized.
There you go. And if we don't save them, and that in itself for me means that the No Outsiders program almost becomes redundant. If what I'm saying is true about it, it becomes almost redundant. Having said all of that, we still need to look and see how do we prepare children to go into a society, into a world where there are different types of relationships, where there are different types of people, and prepare them in such a way that they welcome everybody for how they are, and also protect themselves from ever getting into a situation where they have to, where some of their views. You believe from a religious point of view that homosexuality is not allowed.
Oh, no, let's just get cut to the chase. Can you believe from a religious point of view that black people are inferior to white people and not be a racist? Can you say, well, my religion teaches me this, a religious belief? I mean, to be fair, 200 years ago, this was a religious belief held by many European Christians that went along and, slaughtered thousands, hundreds of thousands of Native Americans and whatever. So there is a religious basis to that belief. But now we disavow that and we say, well, there is no religious justification for racism.
Yeah.
But is there a religious justification, quote unquote, for believing that homosexuality is sinful? Okay. I think the way they distinguish it, you say, well, no. Religion says the practice of homosexuality is sinful.
Yeah.
You are what you are. But I mean, obviously, that's a bit of an artificial academic kind of perspective, isn't it?
Mm. From the Islamic perspective, the orthodox point of view is that homosexuality, the practice of homosexuality is forbidden. Having said that, there are within the spectrum, and contrary to what a lot of Muslims will understand and in terms of know of, is that it isn't categorical and equivalent to, for example, sex outside of marriage. In terms of homosexual relationship, in terms of from the framework of how Orthodox Muslims see it, is not equivalent to sex outside of marriage. It's actually inferred to be wrong as opposed to a direct ruling in the Quran that says it's wrong.
My understanding is that there's no direct reference to it. But
No,
there's the narration of the events of the two cities, Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah. So having said that, even within the context of looking at it from a theological point of view, it's not as cutthroat or straightforward as people make it out.
Why don't we do that? Why don't we have a discussion about the Islamic theological perspective on?
I think we should do quite a bit of research into that. In order to, we can have our discussion generally, but in order to give it the true nuances, and I think that is something that we'll have to do. Having said all of that, I mean, I think that the Muslim community and any community that thinks to be homosexual is sinful, all right, they have to own the fact that is considered homophobic.
Yeah, I think you've got to.
You have to own that.
I know. Well, the thing is, well, all right, put that on one side.
But within the framework of what, and this is where I think the like my own point of view is what you do with another person is none of my business.
Which is the Islamic point of view.
Right, exactly.
My understanding is
exactly
it's a matter between you and the creator. Obviously, if the creator doesn't exist for you, well, then knock yourself out.
Yeah.
If you believe the creator exists, you know, whatever issues you're doing, between you and a person, whether it's a man or a woman, is a matter between you and the creator. No Muslim's got any right to come along and give you their 10 pence worth on it.
Yeah. Especially when it comes to other so-called sins or other accepted sins from the context of the person trying to enjoy good.
But isn't the big thing in Islam that it can't be an open sin? Isn't that sort of a caveat? That sure, your sins are a matter between you and the creator.
But that's hypocritical, because how many people do we see openly buying alcohol, openly
not very many, I've got to be honest.
No, they are. How many
no, Muslims I'm talking about.
Yeah, so if you go to the Muslim community, you're going to find off licenses in the midst of all of these communities.
Yeah, but that's looking at it the wrong way. The correct way to look at it is when you're talking about openness. Okay, look at the people that drink, for example.
Yeah,
Muslims, have they got drink at home on the shelf?
I have relatives who do, yeah.
Right, fair enough. Let me wrap it up by telling you what I think is the main issue about the debate around these protests. So firstly, it's not a fair and accurate reflection of the different positions in the Muslim community and the fundamental right to protest. Even if you're wrong, remember, there's no point in agreeing with protests that you agree with. What kind of right is that?
Yeah.
You've got to be able to accept the right of people to protest, especially where you violently, completely disagree with them. That's the first point. The second point is that my personal belief, and I think the belief shared by some of the parents, if not all of them, is that the role of the state does not extend to teaching children about relationships. Full stop.
Okay.
I'm not getting into homosexual or heterosexual. Full stop. That is the role of the parent. Of course, they should be teaching their children about
actively or passively, because passively your children will learn about.
Of course, but
relationships.
Passively is not. I mean, that's the kind of a.
So, would you be happy with your child studying a book on English literature that refers to heterosexual relationships outside of marriage? Would you be happy with that in primary school?
Yeah, of course. But my point is that if you, yes, I would.
Okay, so would you be happy with your child having a story from which they are studying, and there's a homosexual relationship in that particular? So the focus is not the relationship. The focus is the characters. And what's between them. But it might be, Tom and his boyfriend.
No, I've got no issue with that. But the point that I've got an issue with is it an organic and natural part of the education they're receiving, and it's coincidental that in that there's a relationship between heterosexual people or homosexual people, or is it deliberately put in there to promote a policy of SRE?
I mean, I think that's assuming that the people who wrote in those particular
relationships didn't write Romeo and Juliet to promote heterosexuality.
No, he didn't.
Right? That's my point.
But having said that, there are many. I don't know them off the top of my head, so forgive me for that. But I think there is literature out there that does support, for example, the protagonist being from, for example, the Muslim community, where young people are studying a literature where the protagonist is a Muslim, so they can relate to that better because it's somebody from their community. Similarly, if the protagonist was from the LGBT community, then why is that problematic? Like, for example, one of the characters in Harry Potter, although it was later revealed, is a homosexual man. Dumbledore.
But I thought that came after the fact. I thought after she finished her books.
Yeah, that's right.
And everybody bought him and she made the money. Then she was like, well, actually, by the way, guys, he was gay.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that if that was true and it was not just a gimmick, it wasn't overt in the book. I mean, I think that's one of the complaints about.
So if it was overt, would it be problematic to have?
No, of course not.
There you go.
Because gay people exist. That's right. Not the problem.
That's right.
That's not the problem.
But is that a problem for these parents? Is the question. Would these parents have a problem with that? I think they still would.
A minority, I think, have a problem with gay people existing.
Yes.
I do agree with that. That's true.
No, but I think
that is not an accurate blanket description of them. Is my point. And the interviews that I saw when I was telling you at the very beginning, they're very, very clear. We don't have an issue with homosexuality or whatever. The issue is that we want to teach our children. That's the issue.